Supat Valley Cave Incident. In June 1997, 33-year-old Nasiruddin and his brother Kathir fled their village in northern Pakistan. The Salakel tribe was in a violent feud and staying meant certain death. Nasir left behind his wife and 2 young children to escape the bloodshed. The brothers rode through the night heading for the remote Kohistan region. After hours of riding, they reached Supat Valley with massive glaciers. They needed shelter from strong mountain winds and growing exhaustion. Nasir spotted a dark opening in the glacier wall that looked like a cave. Kathir stayed with the horses while Nasir explored the cave entrance. Inside, the walls glowed with eerie blue light from ancient compressed ice. Nasir moved deeper, looking for a safe place to camp for the night. The floor looked solid with thick blue ice that seemed centuries old. But glacier appearances can be deadly, and the ice was just a thin shell. As Nasir stepped forward, the false floor gave way beneath his feet. He plummeted into a massive crevice that dropped deep into the glacier. After falling over 100 feet, his body slammed into a ledge and he lost consciousness. Above, Kathir heard the crash and found a hole going straight down. He called his brother's name but only heard echoes in response. Kathir ran for help and villagers arrived with ropes and lanterns. They searched for 3 days, but the crevice was too deep and narrow. The glacier began closing the wound and sealing itself shut with new snow. The extreme cold froze Nasir's body almost instantly after impact. The glacier created perfect preservation conditions with no oxygen or moisture. No bacteria could cause decay in the crevice's frozen environment. The cold preserved his skin, clothes, and facial features perfectly. For 28 years, Nasir lay in perfect preservation deep in the ice. His wife waited for news that never came while his children grew up fatherless. Starting in the early 2000s, temperatures in northern Pakistan began rising dramatically. The massive glaciers started melting faster than they ever had before. By 2025, the glacier in Supat Valley had retreated significantly. On August 1st, 2025, Shepherd Omar Khan crossed the melted glacier area. Omar saw something sticking out of the melting ice that looked like a person. It was a man perfectly preserved with his clothes completely intact. He looked like he had just laid down recently, despite decades-old clothing style. Omar found an identity card in the man's pocket reading Nasiruddin. The card was dated from the 1990s, but still perfectly legible after 28 years. Police arrived and records showed Nasir had been reported missing in June 1997. His brother Kathir, now much older, was contacted for the heartbreaking reunion. Time had stood still for Nasir while marching on for everyone else. DNA tests confirmed the identity, though family recognized him immediately. Ottawa River Cave Incident. On July 19, 1988, experienced cave divers John Lamari and Luc LeBlanc explored underwater caves near the Ottawa River. They were part of a 2-week cave diving camp organized by the Speleological Society of Quebec. John Lamari was 37 years old and known as a methodical, safety-conscious diver. The 2 divers approached a spring that looked like a simple surface pool, but beneath the innocent-looking water lay a complex underwater cave system. They entered the water and began their descent into the flooded passage. The underwater tunnel was about 6.5 feet high and 16 feet wide. The maximum depth reached about 20 feet below the surface. Emergency ascent to the surface was impossible due to the rock ceiling above. They swam into the cave system, laying guideline rope as they progressed. This thin rope would be their lifeline back to the surface. The guideline was their only navigation aid in the dark underwater environment. At 295 feet into the cave system, they reached their predetermined turnaround point. Experienced cave divers follow strict air consumption rules for safety. They never use more than 1/3 of their air supply going in. This leaves 1/3 for the return trip and 1/3 for emergencies. Lamari discovered a minor leak in one of his regulators. The 2 divers returned to the surface where Lamari cleaned his equipment. After ensuring his gear worked properly, they re-entered the cave. This second dive was supposed to be routine and safe. At the end of their guideline, Lamari signaled to begin their exit. LeBlanc experienced a minor entanglement with the guideline. It took him only moments to sort out the small problem, but when he looked around in the murky water, he couldn't see Lamari. Visibility was poor and sediment reduced their visual range to just a few feet. Assuming Lamari had gone ahead as planned, LeBlanc followed the guideline out. The return journey felt normal with no reason to suspect anything wrong. When LeBlanc surfaced in the entrance pool, he found himself completely alone. Lamari should have been there waiting and discussing the dive. Every cave diver's worst nightmare was beginning to unfold. Without hesitation, LeBlanc re-entered the cave to search for his partner. He followed the guideline back through 295 feet of underwater passage. The return journey felt like hours as LeBlanc fought growing panic. At the end of their survey line, LeBlanc made a horrifying discovery. John Lamari was floating motionless in the water, clearly dead. His regulator was no longer in his mouth, but his mask remained on. Most disturbing was the blood visible on Lamari's diving mask. This wasn't equipment failure or navigation error, but a medical emergency. LeBlanc's air supply was running dangerously low after the extended search. He was 295 feet from the surface with a deceased partner. Cave diving diving protocol demanded he save himself rather than risk a second death. He managed to move Lamoury's body partway toward the entrance, but his air supply forced him to make the agonizing decision to leave his partner. The swim back alone, abandoning Lamoury in the darkness, traumatized LeBlanc forever. Professional recovery divers returned the next day with specialized equipment. Their investigation revealed Lamoury's equipment was functioning perfectly. His air tank still contained breathable air and showed no equipment failure. There were no signs of entanglement or navigation errors. The blood on his mask suggested he suffered a severe nosebleed. This may have caused suffocation when combined with losing his regulator. Alternatively, he might have experienced a sudden heart problem or aneurysm. What made Lamoury's death so terrifying was its complete randomness. Illinois Cave Incident. On December 3, 2011, 4 experienced cavers entered a remote Illinois cave for a challenging expedition. Chad McCain, Todd McCartney, Ralph Sawyer, and Jason Kern planned to explore water-filled passages with dangerously low airspace. McCartney was 44 years old and the veteran who had explored these passages before. McCain was the newcomer to this specific cave system. McCartney wore a neoprene hoodie over his wetsuit for extra cold water protection. The 4 men worked their way toward the water-filled passage in the cave. When they reached their target, they saw dark, cold water with barely any airspace above. McCain volunteered to lead upstream despite being new to this cave. The water was 3 to 4 feet deep, but the low ceiling forced him to crawl awkwardly. He held his helmet in his hand and pressed his face against the rocky ceiling. The airspace dropped to 6 inches, then to only 3 inches above the water surface. McCain hesitated at this dangerous section with essentially zero margin for error. McCartney saw McCain's hesitation and made a fatal decision to take the lead. He moved past McCain and continued upstream into unexplored territory. McCartney pressed his nose against the ceiling, breathing through minimal airspace. The sensation was claustrophobic and terrifying, like swimming through a water-filled tunnel. McCartney continued for 40 feet beyond where McCain had stopped. As McCartney rounded a bend, the nightmare scenario unfolded before him. The passage angled sharply downward with the ceiling dropping even lower. In the bend, there was virtually no airspace left above the water. McCartney found himself facing a water-filled tube with no room for his head. He tried to back up, but the tight space made it nearly impossible to reverse. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped with no air pocket. The others heard sounds of distress from around the bend. McCartney began kicking and thrashing in the water desperately. McCain called out but got no response from his friend. When McCain reached him, McCartney went underwater and didn't come back up. He finally surfaced floating face down, completely motionless. McCain and Sawyer rushed forward, but the confined space made rescue difficult. McCain finally reached McCartney after about 45 seconds that felt like hours. He grabbed the unconscious man and dragged him downstream towards safety. McCain found a section with more airspace to begin emergency treatment. McCartney's eyes were glassy and showed no signs of consciousness. McCain immediately began CPR in the cramped cave conditions. Sawyer and Kern helped keep McCartney's head out of water during rescue breaths. After 2 to 3 minutes, McCartney suddenly regained consciousness. The relief was overwhelming, but they knew they weren't safe yet. They moved him to a mud bank where he could sit up and recover. The journey out was a nightmare of endurance and determination. They had to navigate a 300-foot crawl with only 6 inches of airspace. McCain created a flotation device using waterproof packs tied to his waist. McCartney could rest his head on the packs while McCain pulled him through. Hour after hour, they worked their way through the cave system obstacles. Finally, 6 hours after entering, all 4 men emerged from the cave. McCartney was taken to the hospital where he spent 4 days recovering. Doctors confirmed he had nearly drowned, and his friend's quick action saved his life. Cenote Chacmul Cave Incident. On April 19, 2012, 3 divers entered Cenote Chacmul in Mexico late in the afternoon. Carlos was a 28-year-old diving guide who had worked at the cenote for 2 years. He had performed hundreds of cavern dives in the safe zone where natural light could reach. But Carlos had a dangerous secret. He wasn't certified to lead cave diving trips. That afternoon, Carlos met Marina and Eduardo, a young Brazilian couple on their honeymoon. The newlyweds had saved for months to afford this trip to Mexico. They arrived just 1 hour before the cenote closed for the day. As they prepared their equipment, Carlos made a deadly decision. He had noticed stunning rock formations deeper in the dangerous cave zone. The 3 divers entered the water as staff began closing procedures. Carlos led Marina and Eduardo through the initial underwater passages. The water was perfectly clear with schools of fish swimming between rock formations. Marina swam close to Eduardo, amazed by the underwater cathedral-like atmosphere. As they swam deeper, Carlos began leading them away from the safe cavern zone. The natural light from the surface grew dimmer, but the couple trusted their guide. They had no way of knowing they were entering an area requiring advanced certification. The overhead openings to the surface became fewer until they disappeared entirely. They were now in the dark zone where only experienced cave divers should venture. About 80 meters from the surface, Carlos began to realize his mistake. The passage ahead split into multiple tunnels, and he wasn't sure which way led back. Marina was the first to show signs of distress in the overhead environment. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, consuming her air supply much faster. Eduardo noticed his wife's distress and tried to signal to Carlos. As Marina's air supply dwindled, panic began to set in completely. She tried to swim upward but found only solid rock overhead. The realization that she was trapped underground overwhelmed her completely. Eduardo made the fatal decision to share his air with his panicking wife. In the stress and confusion of the cave, this became nearly impossible to execute safely. Both newlyweds were now consuming Eduardo's air supply at a dangerous rate. Carlos finally realized the severity of the situation, but it was too late. Marina had already inhaled water as her air supply ran out completely. Eduardo tried desperately to save his wife, but had exhausted his own air. In the darkness with no natural light, all three divers became disoriented. Above the surface, the cenote had officially closed for the day. Staff noticed Carlos and his clients hadn't returned, but weren't immediately concerned. As evening wore on with no sign of the divers, concern grew into alarm. Emergency services were notified and a search and rescue operation began. Cave diving rescue teams were called in with powerful lights and specialized equipment. Shortly before 2 a.m. on April 20th, the search teams made the tragic discovery. The three bodies were found deep in the cave zone, far beyond the safe area. Piano Cave Incident. On November 21st, 2021, 16 people entered a cave near Lake Bayano in Panama. The group included 11 locals from Panama, 1 Canadian tourist, and 4 friends from Venezuela. Their guide had been leading cave tours for over 10 years and knew the caves perfectly. The group put on their headlamps and entered the cave entrance for what seemed like a routine tour. Everything started perfectly as the guide pointed out incredible rock formations. But while they were underground, dangerous weather was developing above them. Heavy storm clouds were rolling in fast, carrying massive amounts of water. When it rains hard above ground, all that water flows down into the cave system. The group had been underground for about an hour when their guide suddenly stopped. He tilted his head like he was listening to something that made his blood run cold. The gentle dripping sound always present in caves was getting much louder. The guide shouted instructions for everyone to move to higher ground immediately. Everyone could hear a distant rumbling sound coming from deeper in the cave. The cave was flooding and they were directly in the path of the rushing water. Above ground, the storm was pounding the jungle with devastating force. The guide started yelling instructions to follow him toward higher chambers, but water was pouring in everywhere, transforming the cave before their eyes. The limestone floors that had been easy to walk on were now slick as ice. The water was rising fast and the current was getting stronger every second. The guide was checking on each member, making sure nobody got left behind. He reached back to help one of the Venezuelan tourists navigate a treacherous section, but the cave floor was so slippery from all the rushing water. In that split second, his foot slipped and he fell hard. His headlamp went flying and smashed against the cave wall. The current grabbed him immediately and swept him toward the darkness. The group tried to save him by forming a human chain. Their guide managed to grab onto a rock in the rushing water. For a brief moment, it looked like they might pull him to safety, but the rock was wet and the current was relentless. His grip slipped, and in that instant, he was gone. Even as the water carried him away, he shouted instructions to save the group. 15 people were now trapped in a flooding cave with no guide and limited light. Above ground, a local man who had waved at them grew worried and contacted emergency services. Back inside the cave, the water kept rising with a deafening roar. The Canadian tourist used his camera flash to help light their surroundings. The water was now waist deep and strong enough to knock people down. As they fought through flooding passages, 2 more people were claimed by the water. A middle-aged Panamanian man lost his footing in the vicious current. A young Venezuelan woman was also swept away as people tried to help. In minutes, they went from 16 excited tourists to 13 terrified survivors. The remaining 13 somehow managed to keep going through the nightmare. They climbed over rocks and pulled each other through flooded passages. Their headlamp batteries were dying, adding another layer of terror. They spent hours in freezing water in almost complete darkness. Eventually, the 13 survivors found their way to a higher chamber. They were exhausted, freezing, and traumatized beyond belief. When rescue teams finally reached them, they had been through hell. All 13 survivors emerged from the cave alive, but forever changed. The guide's body was recovered the next day, along with the 2 other victims. Lookout Mountain Cave Incident. On Monday morning, March 2nd, 2022, 2 young men stood at an unmarked cave on Lookout Mountain, Tennessee. Gabriel Vaughn, 21, and Robbie Dobos, 23, knew they shouldn't be there because of clear no trespassing signs, but the lure of unexplored darkness proved too strong to resist. The cave system was a multi-level labyrinth that stretched for miles underground. Most explorers knew to bring proper gear for the infamous 600-foot crawl deep within the system. Gabriel and Robbie had neither experience nor proper equipment. They only had headlamps, regular clothes, and the reckless confidence of youth. The entrance welcomed them with cool cool, damp air and the scent of ancient stone. Gabriel led the way with his footsteps echoing off wet stone walls. They felt like explorers discovering a new world, unaware of the dangers ahead. Hours passed unnoticed as they marked their route casually with small stones. The passages grew more complex with tunnels branching off in multiple directions. Then came the crawl where the passage narrowed dramatically to belly-crawling size. Water seeped constantly through limestone cracks, creating a shallow stream. For 600 feet, they wriggled forward through the claustrophobic tunnel. Cold water penetrated every layer of clothing, stealing precious body heat. When they emerged into a larger chamber, their bodies were shaking uncontrollably. Hypothermia had begun during the brutal crawl as wet clothes clung like ice. Disorientation set in as passages looked identical under weakening lights. Their casual trail markers seemed to have vanished, or they couldn't recognize them. Fear crept in as battery levels dropped and headlamps dimmed to faint glows. They wandered for hours through identical passages, growing weaker and more confused. Seeking shelter, they huddled together in a small chamber deep underground. Tuesday came and went while they remained trapped in their underground prison. Tuesday evening, worried families contacted the Chattanooga Fire Department. 2 young men had failed to return from unauthorized cave exploration. The rescue lieutenant knew the cave intimately after 15 years of service. Her team assembled with specialized equipment for the notorious 600-foot crawl. The search began immediately, but the cave system was vast with miles of passages. The rescue was complicated by active railway lines that could destabilize rocks. Rescuers coordinated with railway dispatch to minimize dangerous train traffic. The team split into groups, calling out and listening for responses through the night. At 3:45 a.m. on Wednesday morning, rescuers found voices echoing from the farthest section. Gabriel and Robbie were discovered nearly 2 miles from the entrance. They were conscious but severely hypothermic after over 36 hours underground. Rescuers immediately provided warm clothing and emergency food supplies. The young men were weak but able to walk with assistance. The journey back required going through the same 600-foot crawl again. Rescue team members guided them through the narrow passage with encouragement. Emergency heat packs prevented hypothermia from worsening during extraction. Norfolk Southern had to halt train traffic for several hours during rescue operations. By dawn Wednesday, Gabriel and Robbie emerged from the cave entrance. Paramedics waited with warming blankets and hot beverages for immediate care. Both young men recovered fully but faced potential criminal trespassing charges. Halona Blowhole Cave Incident. On June 30th, 2002, 18-year-old Daniel Dick visited the Halona Blowhole on Oahu's southeastern shore. Daniel had just graduated from First Lutheran High School in Los Angeles, where he was student body president. He was in Hawaii celebrating his graduation with his mother and 2 brothers. The Halona Blowhole is one of Hawaii's most popular but dangerous tourist attractions. It was formed thousands of years ago when lava flows created underwater caverns connected to the ocean. When Pacific waves crash into these chambers, water gets compressed and shoots up 30 feet high. Most tourists view this natural wonder from the designated safe viewing area. Multiple warning signs in several languages warn visitors about the life-threatening dangers. A heavy-duty locked gate prevents access to the most hazardous sections. Local authorities spent years and resources keeping tourists at a safe distance. On this Sunday afternoon around 3 p.m., Daniel arrived at the blowhole. Despite seeing all the warning signs clearly posted around the area, he ignored them. Multiple witnesses were actively shouting at him not to go near the dangerous opening. Daniel deliberately climbed over the locked gate that was there for protection. He walked directly past the warning signs without pausing to read them. Despite people pleading with him to reconsider, he approached the blowhole opening. This was the exact spot where pressurized ocean water shoots up with incredible force. The pressure is enormous, the force is unpredictable, and the timing is completely random. At around 3:15 p.m., Daniel was straddling the opening of the blowhole. He stood with one foot on each side, directly over the violent hydraulic force. Dozens of horrified tourists watched from the safe viewing area. Daniel positioned himself as a human bridge over nature's most unpredictable phenomenon. Then in a split second, a massive Pacific wave crashed into the underwater system. A colossal plume of water exploded up through the opening with tremendous force. Daniel was instantly blasted 3 to 5 feet into the air by the hydraulic explosion. As he came back down, he fell directly into the blowhole opening itself. Witnesses immediately started screaming for help and called 911 within minutes. Everyone knew this would likely be a recovery operation, not a rescue. Daniel's body went down into the blowhole and into the underwater lava tube system. Massive water surges would have tossed him around like a rag doll. The Honolulu Fire Department launched a comprehensive search operation immediately. They deployed boats to scan surrounding ocean waters and helicopters overhead. Experienced rescue divers prepared to enter the dangerous blowhole system. Captain Richard Sue led the rescue operation situation against incredible odds. Rescue teams worked through the night in dangerous conditions with rotating shifts. Choppy seas made boat operations difficult and currents were unpredictable. Even experienced divers could only work in short intervals for safety. On Monday morning at 10:15 a.m., divers finally located Daniel's body. He was found about 20 feet from the blowhole opening on the sandy bottom. B&G Sinkhole Cave Incident. On August 14, 1999, 4 experienced cave explorers went to evaluate a Utah cave system. Rodney Mulder, Doug Zetis, Wesley Gurney, and Brent Hobbs were seasoned spelunkers. They weren't there for recreation but to evaluate if the cave was suitable for rescue training. These were professional rescuers who got called when other people got trapped underground. The B&G Sinkhole was in rugged Utah terrain, part of a vast underground network. This was serious caving territory for experienced explorers with proper equipment only. Their plan was simple and routine: rig ropes and survey the cave dimensions. Doug Zetis was chosen to make the descent into the sinkhole. The team carefully rigged their rope system and checked all safety equipment. Everything looked perfect as Zetis began his descent into the cave. He rappelled down smoothly according to plan at first, but as Zetis continued down, something became terrifyingly apparent. The rope wasn't long enough to reach the cave floor. When he reached the end, he was dangling 40 feet above the bottom. He was stranded in the most dangerous position possible. Too far down to climb back up easily and too far to safely drop. Zetis needed to use his ascenders to climb back up the rope. Ascenders are mechanical devices that grip rope and allow climbers to walk up vertically. But as Zetis tried to use his ascenders, he ran into a deadly problem. The cave was covered in thick, cold, clinging mud everywhere. As he had rappelled down, the rope dragged through this mud. The entire length of rope was now coated with thick, clay-like substance. When Zetis tried to use his ascenders, the mud clogged the mechanisms. The devices couldn't grip the slick, mud-covered rope surface. Instead of locking in place, the ascenders kept slipping down. The cold mud was covering him and soaking through his clothing. Underground caves maintain constant cool temperatures around 50 degrees. Being covered in cold, wet mud was rapidly sapping his body heat. Hypothermia was becoming a real and immediate threat to his life. Zetis tried desperately to clean mud out of his ascenders while hanging. Working with frozen fingers in complete darkness was nearly impossible. Every time he cleared some mud, the ascenders would slip again. The psychological pressure was overwhelming for the experienced rescuer. Finally, Zetis called up to his teammates explaining his dire situation. His ascenders had failed and he needed immediate assistance to survive. The 3 men at the top understood the gravity immediately. This wasn't minor equipment failure, but a life-threatening emergency. Mulder, Gurney, and Hobbs quickly rigged a haul system with pulleys. This would allow them to physically pull Zetis back up the rope. Hauling a full-grown man up 40 feet requires significant mechanical advantage. One mistake could send Zetis plummeting to certain death below. They had to pull a few feet at a time and reset their grip. All the while, Zetis hung in darkness, fighting hypothermia. The same mud made the entire rope system slippery and unpredictable. Inch by agonizing inch, they pulled him back toward the surface. The haul system strained under the load in a race against time. After what felt like eternity, Zetis finally reached the top safely. Wimmer Cave Incident. On March 29, 2003, the York Grotto Cave explorers met at Wimmer Cave in Pennsylvania for a routine trip. Mark Engel had planned the expedition, splitting the group into 2 teams. Kevin Dunleavy, a 41-year-old experienced spelunker, led the second group deeper into limestone passages. They had proper equipment, backup lights, and years of experience navigating tight spaces. They reached a junction where a tight passage branched toward the back of the cave. The passage led to something called the Shoemaker Room. Dunleavy had never been down this route, but heard it was a quick 10 to 20-minute trip. The group made a fatal decision to leave their packs at the junction. All their emergency equipment, backup gear, and rescue tools stayed behind. 3 members decided to stay with the packs and wait for the others to return. Dunleavy and 3 others continued into the narrow passage. The walls immediately closed in, forcing them to crouch, then crawl. The rock formations became more complex with loose stones and unstable formations. They encountered an 18-inch high crawl space that forced them to their bellies. Above them, wedged rocks formed a makeshift ceiling of breakdown formations. The rocks were clearly not part of the original cave structure, but fallen debris. Breakdown formations are notoriously unstable and can shift without warning. One by one, the group squeezed through the crawl underneath the wedged rocks. Dunleavy had to remove his helmet to fit through the tight space. When they emerged from the crawl, they made a crushing discovery. The passage ended in a blank wall with no shoemaker room. They had risked their lives crawling under unstable rocks for nothing. Now they had to make the same dangerous journey back in reverse. As Dunleavy turned to lead back through the crawl, he saw the full horror. The breakdown formation was far more unstable than he had realized. Loose rocks were balanced precariously, creating a house of cards. Dunleavy was halfway through when physics caught up with them. A 50-pound rock, disturbed by vibrations, shifted in the breakdown above. The stone crashed down directly onto Dunleavy's upper legs, pinning him. The rock was wedged so tightly it seemed cemented in place. Dunleavy was trapped lying on his back with a boulder crushing his legs. He couldn't move forward, backward, turn around, or even sit up. The 3 group members behind him were now trapped in the dead-end passage. Their only experienced leader was injured and immobilized. The trapped team tried moving the rock, but it wouldn't budge even slightly. They needed tools to break or lift it properly, but their equipment was unreachable. All their rescue tools were sitting in packs on the other side of the crawl. The decision to leave their packs behind now seemed incredibly stupid. Dunleavy called out to the 3 members waiting at the junction. 2 immediately left to find Mark Engel and the other group for help. Sky Fisher stayed behind to try helping the trapped team. The pain was becoming unbearable as the breakdown continued to shift above. After 30 minutes, one trapped member remembered he had rope in his personal pack. Fisher was able to reach through cracks and retrieve the rope. This gave them their first real chance to engineer a solution. Working in the confined crawl was like performing surgery in a shoebox. Every movement had to be precise to avoid shifting more rocks. After several attempts, Dunleavy managed to lift the rock slightly. The others worked rope around the boulder to create better leverage. Working together, they lifted the rock just enough for Dunleavy to slide free. The moment he was clear, Dunleavy scrambled out faster than ever before. The others quickly followed, not wanting to spend another second under unstable rocks. They emerged like survivors of a mine collapse, grateful to be alive. Cueva de la Venta Cave Incident. On January 4th, 1989, 3 experienced spelunkers went to explore Cueva de la Venta in Mexico. Cynthia Van, Ray Hardcastle, and John Pint were doing a routine scouting mission. Cueva de la Venta was a massive lava tube near Tequila Volcano. The cave was famous for its 75 entrances that let in natural light. They traveled light with just one 6-volt flashlight and a weak disposable light. Since most of the cave was naturally lit, they didn't think they needed much equipment. The first part was beautiful with sunlight streaming through entrances. As they went deeper, the entrances became fewer and natural light faded. They reached a narrow section where the passage was only a foot wide at floor level. Above their heads, it opened to about 5 feet across. The cheerful sunlight was completely gone in this dark area. They squeezed into the narrow passage, moving sideways in single file. The walls pressed against their bodies in the confined space. Their flashlight began to dim as the battery died faster than expected. They were now far from the last entrance they had passed. The 6-volt flashlight flickered once, then went out completely. Complete darkness swallowed them where they couldn't see anything. John grabbed his nearly dead disposable flashlight with shaking hands. The weak beam came on, barely lighting up 3 feet ahead. That's when they saw a massive snake stretched across the narrow passage. The snake was 6 feet long, coiled up like a living roadblock. Its head was raised with tongue flicking, sensing the intruders. Cynthia accidentally stepped on it, making the snake aggressive. The snake's eyes reflected the weak light as it stared at them. A low hiss filled the narrow space as the snake opened its mouth. They could see its fangs with a striking range of at least 2 feet. In the confined passage, there was nowhere to dodge an attack. Then their last light died and absolute darkness returned. They could hear the snake moving, repositioning itself and breathing. The creature was invisible but blocking their escape route. Nobody moved or spoke as the snake's presence filled the space. Hardcastle decided to back away slowly in complete darkness. He felt his way along the wall, moving carefully to avoid alerting the snake. When he reached daylight, he found a fallen pole about 8 feet long. Going back into the darkness was terrifying as he carried the pole. Working by feel, he positioned the pole above the snake's body. The creature sensed the threat and started thrashing, trying to escape. With the pole holding the snake down, they pressed against the wall. The snake's anger was intense with constant hissing echoing through the passage. Hardcastle lifted the pole and ran as the snake's fury followed them. They stumbled and ran through the narrow passage guided by memory. They didn't stop until they reached the main tunnel and natural light. Rio Camuy Cave Incident. On November 19, 2006, 13 tourists traveled to Rio Camuy in Puerto Rico for cave exploration. Winfredo Lopez Lucis was their 34-year-old guide with professional cave certification. He had guided hundreds of groups through these caves during his career. Carlos Lopez was his teammate who helped with the rope systems. The group included 3 adults and 8 children excited for their adventure. Heavy rains had fallen the day before, making the underground river much higher than usual. They walked toward the area where the underground river emerged from deep earth. The Rio Camuy had carved channels with walls reaching 40 feet high. Winfredo's teammate had warned him the river was flowing dangerously high. This was much higher than normal and potentially dangerous for the group. They reached the edge and looked down at the river moving through the channel. Near a 6-foot waterfall was a hydraulic where water spun in deadly circles. This was a spot where objects could get trapped forever, spinning until they sank. Winfredo and Carlos began setting up their rope system with anchor points. Carlos got ready to go down first to check the river conditions safely. Safety rules demanded someone inspect the area before everyone descended. Carlos clipped his gear to the rope and started rappelling down. He moved along the ledge and stayed away from the dangerous waterfall. The hydraulic churned beneath him with more aggression than usual. Winfredo studied the setup, but something bothered him about the water sound. The hydraulic looked more aggressive with debris swirling in the current. Despite warnings about changing conditions, Winfredo Winfredo decided to descend too. People above began giving him clear and urgent warnings not to go down, but Winfredo was already committed and began his descent on the rope. Someone screamed desperately at him not to go down there. Winfredo's foot slipped on wet rock that was slicker than expected. His grip on the rope shifted and suddenly he was falling instead of rappelling. Though the belay system caught him, momentum carried him toward the water. He hit the river with a splash that echoed through the channel. The current grabbed him immediately with tremendous power. The tension on the belay line yanked Carlos from his safe position. The rope connecting them became a liability instead of safety equipment. Both men disappeared behind the waterfall within seconds. Above them, tourists watched in horror as their guides vanished. Children began crying and adults shouted questions with no answers. Carlos felt the hydraulics power as water pushed him down, then up repeatedly. The belay line connected him to Winfredo but anchored him to the hydraulics grip. 5 times Carlos fought his way to where Winfredo struggled against the current. The first time he grabbed Winfredo's arm, but the current tore them apart. The second time he tried to lift his head above water, unsuccessfully. On the third touch, Carlos grasped Winfredo's harness, but his body felt limp. The belay line had jammed above and couldn't be released quickly enough. When the line finally came free, both men washed into calmer water downstream. Carlos managed to untie himself and drag Winfredo's body onto a rock ledge. He began CPR immediately, pressing on his chest and breathing into his lungs. But the hydraulic had held them too long, and Winfredo was gone. Emergency services were called and rescue teams mobilized quickly. The 13 tourists were evacuated first through the cave system. Their adventure ended in tragedy as they emerged shaken and silent. Winfredo's body was recovered with careful precision by the rescue team. Little River Spring Cave Incident. On February 16, 2002, 2 experienced cave divers entered Little River Spring in Florida for a routine dive. Pete Reagan was 55 years old with over 300 logged cave dives under his belt. Frank Murphy, 43, was also an experienced cave diver and Reagan's diving partner. Little River Spring was part of Florida's underwater cave systems that snake through limestone bedrock. These weren't typical scuba diving spots, but serious cave diving territory for experts only. Reagan and Murphy were diving with a group of friends at the spring that day. The plan was straightforward: explore deeper passages and return before air supplies ran low. The group descended into the cave system and began their underwater exploration. The visibility was excellent, water temperature comfortable, and everything went according to plan. They planned to dive to the dome room, a large chamber deep within the cave system, but as they approached the area, the dive leader made a conservative decision. He called for the group to turn around before reaching the dome room. This followed proper safety protocols by leaving plenty of air for the exit. As the group began their exit, 2 divers made a side trip to Harper Tunnel. This left Pete Reagan and Frank Murphy to continue toward the entrance together. Murphy took the lead position with Reagan following behind him. Murphy was swimming steadily toward the entrance, following the main passage back. The dive was going perfectly with plenty of air and good visibility. About 500 feet from the entrance, Murphy realized something was terribly wrong. He looked back to check on Reagan and discovered his partner wasn't behind him. In cave diving, losing sight of your partner is extremely dangerous. Murphy immediately turned back upstream to look for Reagan. What he found about 40 feet behind him was the stuff of nightmares. Pete Reagan was in full body convulsions, completely unconscious and unresponsive. Murphy was 500 feet inside an underwater cave with a partner having seizures. Reagan's entire body was convulsing violently while underwater. Murphy's training kicked in, and he swam to Reagan's aid immediately. He managed to get Reagan's regulator back into his mouth. But when Murphy checked Reagan's breathing, he wasn't breathing at all. Murphy began forced ventilation using Reagan's regulator to force air into his lungs. This was incredibly difficult to perform underwater in a confined cave passage. Murphy was performing artificial respiration while swimming to keep them both alive. The forced ventilation seemed to work initially as Reagan began breathing intermittently, but the breathing kept stopping, forcing Murphy to repeatedly perform the procedure. Murphy tried to tow Reagan's unconscious body back toward the cave entrance. He was performing life-saving medical procedures while navigating tight underwater passages. Murphy's own air supply was being rapidly depleted from the rescue effort. About 30 feet before the entrance, Murphy ran out of air completely. In a desperate move, Murphy switched to Reagan's air supply. Both divers were now dependent on a single air source to survive. Murphy continued towing Reagan while breathing from his partner's regulator. Somehow, Murphy managed to reach the cave entrance with Reagan still alive. As they emerged into the spring pool, other divers sprang into action. They pulled Reagan from the water and began CPR immediately. The scene was chaotic but organized with multiple people performing chest compressions. When paramedics arrived, they took over resuscitation efforts and transported Reagan. Northfield Cave Incident. On the night of November 1st, 1986, 5 college students decided to dig into a sealed cave near their campus. The caves near Northfield, Minnesota, were part of limestone cave systems in the upper Midwest. St. Olaf College sits in Northfield, where caves had become a local attraction attraction for adventurous students. But the particular cave in this story had been deliberately sealed 8 years earlier. Local authorities had filled the entrance with dirt and debris to prevent people from entering. When caves get sealed, it's usually because they're unstable or too dangerous. On this Saturday night, 5 students from St. Olaf College decided to ignore the sealed entrance. These weren't experienced cave explorers, but college kids looking for adventure. The group included Thomas E. Johnson, a 20-year-old student excited for the exploration. The students arrived at the sealed entrance with only flashlights. They found it completely blocked with dirt, rocks, and debris. A smart group would have realized this wasn't a place they should enter, but these 5 students decided to dig using bare hands and a single pail. They began tunneling through the sealed entrance in cramped conditions. They were digging through unstable fill material that had been deliberately placed there. The students worked for hours, taking turns crawling into their makeshift tunnel. As the night wore on, they managed to tunnel about 15 feet through the entrance, but every handful of dirt they removed made their tunnel more unstable. The loose fill material above was held up only by the material below. At around midnight, after hours of digging, the inevitable happened. The fill material above their tunnel collapsed suddenly and catastrophically. One moment Thomas Johnson was inside working, the next tons of earth crashed down. The weight was enormous, like several dump truck loads of dirt and debris. 3 other students just inside the entrance weren't completely buried, but were caught. They found themselves trapped with their friend Thomas under tons of earth ahead. The 5th student who was outside remained completely free and able to help. The panic was immediate and overwhelming for everyone involved. The students partially trapped were screaming for Thomas and trying to dig. The student outside immediately understood this was beyond what they could handle. He ran to get help, knowing his friend was buried alive. When emergency services received the call, they immediately dispatched rescue teams. Professional rescue workers arrived with proper equipment to locate Thomas, but they had to work carefully to avoid triggering another collapse. The other 3 students were extracted relatively quickly, but were in shock. The rescue workers had to guess Thomas's location and begin removing debris. Working in the dark and cramped conditions, the rescue team began digging. They knew they were racing against time to save Thomas. At approximately 1:30 a.m., rescue workers finally located Thomas Johnson's body. Trapdoor Cave Incident. On Thanksgiving weekend 1981, 16 people entered Trapdoor Cave in Indiana for a routine caving expedition. Trapdoor Cave sits near Bloomington in Monroe County, Indiana. The cave gets its name from the narrow, restrictive entrance that acts like a trap door. The group included 10 experienced cavers, 4 members from Michigan Interlakes Grotto, and 2 complete novices. On Saturday morning, they entered with all their equipment, including headlamps, ropes, and extra batteries. They spent about 2 hours underground exploring various passages and chambers. Everything went perfectly during their exploration with stable weather above ground. The cave was in good condition and the group worked well together. They took their time enjoying formations and documenting several passages, but caves are dynamic environments that can change without warning. Rock formations, stable for decades, can suddenly shift due to various factors. As the group began their exit, they moved through the entrance passage in single file. 2 members had already cleared the entrance completely and were safely outside. Glenn Anders, an experienced member, was almost to the entrance when disaster struck. Without any warning, the wall of the stream gully at the entrance completely collapsed. The collapse was catastrophic and instantaneous with no creaking or rumbling. 3 massive rocks, each weighing 1,400 pounds, broke free and crashed down. The huge stone slammed directly on top of Glenn Anders. 1 rock hit his left shoulder with crushing force, while 2 others pinned his head. Anders drew his legs up toward his chest in a natural defensive reaction. This probably saved his life, but put him in an incredibly compromised position. With his legs drawn up and torso pinned, he could barely expand his chest to breathe. Every breath was a struggle as the weight slowly crushed his body. The 14 others behind Anders found themselves trapped in complete darkness. The narrow passage that was their only way out was now blocked by tons of rock. Don Maxwell, just behind Anders, could hear him struggling to breathe nearby. Maxwell tried to help Anders extend his legs to relieve chest pressure. Outside the cave, a medical student was at the entrance when the collapse occurred. He immediately squeezed through gaps in the collapsed entrance to reach Anders. Working in darkness with limited space, he loosened Anders's chin strap. He conducted a quick examination and found Anders conscious and responsive. The medical student felt a depressed area on Anders's shoulder, indicating possible fractures. Anders's compromised breathing was the most immediate concern. The 2 members who had exited safely ran to call emergency rescue services. They knew conventional equipment might not move rocks weighing over 1,400 pounds each. The 14 trapped spelunkers retreated to an upper-level room to regroup. Being sealed underground with no obvious way out created enormous psychological impact. Rescue personnel arrived and set up a block and tackle system. This mechanical advantage system would allow them to move extremely heavy objects. The rescue team's first priority was removing the smallest of the 3 rocks. The operation was painstakingly slow and dangerous to avoid disturbing larger rocks. rocks. Any shift could crush Anders completely or cause additional rocks to fall. The medical student continued monitoring Anders's vital signs and breathing. After hours of careful work, they successfully removed the smallest rock. This provided some breathing relief, but Anders was still pinned under 2 larger stones. After a few more hours, they removed enough rocks to free Glenn Anders. He was carefully extracted and immediately transported to the hospital. Dante's Descent Cave Incident. Dante's Descent sits in the high desert near Ash Fork, Arizona, about 50 miles west of Flagstaff. This is a remote, dangerous natural pit that drops 300 feet straight down into the earth. The formation gets its ominous name from Dante's Inferno because it looks like a gateway to hell. On September 23, 1986, 33-year-old Eugene Campbell had been drawn to this remote desert pit. A few days before September 23, 2 experienced cave explorers encountered Campbell at the pit. They found him sitting alone at the edge with his legs hanging over, drinking beer. He appeared very despondent and deeply troubled to the experienced spelunkers. The 2 explorers were concerned enough to approach him and assess his state of mind. Campbell eventually left the area that day, but the spelunkers remained worried. His friends also became worried about him after that incident. They were specifically concerned that he might be contemplating harming himself. Campbell had apparently been exhibiting behavior that made people who cared about him worried. On the night of September 23rd, shortly after midnight, Campbell returned to Dante's Descent. This time he convinced a friend to come with him to the remote location. The 2 men arrived in the darkness with flashlights as their only light source. Dante's Descent is intimidating during the day but terrifying at night. A flashlight beam can't penetrate 300 feet of darkness in the massive void. Campbell and his friend approached the edge of the pit in the darkness, but something went horribly wrong at the edge of the pit that night. According to the witness account, Campbell suddenly fell into the pit. One moment he was standing at the edge, the next moment he was gone. He plummeted 300 feet down into the darkness of Dante's Descent. His friend watched in absolute horror as Campbell disappeared into the black void below. The sound of someone falling 300 feet would have been terrifying to hear. Campbell's friend was suddenly alone at the edge, knowing his companion had fallen. There was no way to climb down or reach Campbell in the darkness. The psychological trauma of witnessing this would have been overwhelming for the friend. The friend somehow managed to get help in his state of shock. When emergency responders arrived, they confirmed no one could survive a 300-foot fall. The recovery of Campbell's body was an extremely dangerous and complex operation. Professional rescue teams rappelled down 300 feet using specialized equipment. The vertical walls required ropes anchored into solid rock for safety. At the bottom, working in darkness, they secured Campbell's body into a stretcher. A coordinated pulley system was used to lift the stretcher, inch by inch. But questions remain about what really happened that night at the pit. Did Campbell slip accidentally while trying to get a better look? Was he under the influence of alcohol as suggested by his earlier drinking? Did his previous despondent behavior mean this wasn't an accident at all? Campbell's friend would be the only person who could answer these questions. But the trauma might have affected his ability to provide clear details. The fact that Campbell had been seen in a despondent state days earlier raises questions. Combined with his friend's concerns, it's possible this wasn't purely accidental. Alternatively, Campbell might have genuinely slipped on uneven ground in the darkness. Eugene Campbell's death remains a tragedy regardless of what truly happened. A 33-year-old man lost his life falling 300 feet into a dark desert pit. His friend was left with traumatic memories that would haunt him forever. Dreebelbis Cave Incident. On Saturday evening, October 1st, 1983, 6 experienced cave explorers entered Dreebelbis Cave near Kutztown, Pennsylvania. These were seasoned spelunkers who knew the underground world intimately. For hours, they navigated underground passages, making their way deeper into the earth. Around 2 a.m., the group decided to head back to the surface. Robert E. Scott, 36 years old, was bringing up the rear of the group. Scott found himself about 75 feet from the cave entrance in a vertical crevice. The passage was a narrow slot stretching 80 feet high and generally 12 inches wide, but the crevice narrowed to only 7 to 8 inches in its middle section. As Scott maneuvered through this tight section, his hand slipped on wet rock. Without warning, his body dropped down into the narrowest part of the crevice. Scott found himself wedged tightly on his left side between rock walls. Every surface was rounded and slick with mud, with nothing to grab onto. Scott's companions quickly discovered his predicament when they lost contact with him. No matter what they tried, they couldn't get Scott free from the crevice. After 8 grueling hours of failed attempts, they left to get outside help. At 9:30 a.m. per Sunday morning, volunteers from 4 fire departments arrived. The complexity became apparent as Scott was wedged deep underground. Authorities contacted the National Cave Rescue Commission for specialized help. By Sunday afternoon, 14 highly trained cave rescue specialists flew in from Pittsburgh. When the team first contacted Scott, he was in good spirits and alert. But as Sunday wore on, Scott's demeanor began to change dramatically. The psychological pressure of being trapped began taking its toll. Scott became increasingly irrational and abusive toward his rescuers. The rescue team learned that Scott was epileptic, adding medical complexity. Twice during the rescue, he was given medication to prevent seizures. Rescuers strung a high line above Scott and placed slings around his body. Every time they made progress, Scott would begin thrashing wildly. His violent movements defeated any progress and worsened his situation. The rescue team established monitoring equipment to track his vital signs. Keeping him warm became critical as cave temperatures can cause hypothermia. They used heat packs, high-intensity lights, and hair dryers for warmth. Despite being trapped, Scott was able to eat and drink throughout the ordeal, but Scott's erratic behavior became the biggest obstacle to his rescue. He screamed abuse at the very people risking their lives to save him. The medical team recognized that sedation might be key to successful rescue. However, doctors refused to authorize the use of tranquilizers or sedatives. Technical rescue efforts continued with inflatable airbags, grease, and plastic sheeting. The crevice seemed designed to prevent exactly what they were trying to accomplish. As Monday morning approached, Scott had been trapped for over 24 hours. Around 7 a.m. Monday, as Scott delivered another tantrum, disaster struck. His vital signs suddenly ceased and the monitoring equipment went flat. Scott lost consciousness after his body succumbed to incredible stress. The rescue team immediately began emergency medical procedures. After 29 hours underground, Robert Scott's body had reached its limits. With Scott unconscious, they used painful extraction methods to drag him upward. At 12:25 p.m. Monday, Scott was finally freed after over 30 hours trapped. But shortly after extraction, Robert E. Scott was pronounced dead. Toluca Cave Incident. On June 29, 2005, students and instructors gathered at Toluca Cave in Alabama for a training exercise. They were part of the National Cave Rescue Commission's summer seminar. Their mission was to practice rescuing an injured person from a 35-foot vertical drop. The group descended into Toluca Cave through the main entrance. After 20 minutes through twisting passages, they reached a larger chamber. Finally, they reached the skylight room with a vertical pit. This would be their training ground to practice hauling an injured person up. Tim Lawn, 41 years old, volunteered to serve as the pretend patient. His background in rope systems made him perfect for the role. The next hour was spent carefully preparing the rope system. Students assembled complex rigging using climbing ropes under instructor supervision. They installed anchors in solid rock and tested every connection. 2 students were designated as edge attendants to guide the rope. Every piece of equipment was inspected twice for safety. Lawn put on his harness, connected his device, and clipped into the line. Lawn began his descent over the lip of the pit as planned. The lowering operation proceeded with textbook precision. Every few feet, Lawn called out his status to those above. The team reconfigured their rope system to haul Lawn back up. The hauling command echoed and the team began pulling together. One edge attendant called out that Lawn was 15 feet up from the bottom. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Then disaster struck without any warning. A sharp crack echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Several chunks of limestone broke free from the lip above. The rocks began their deadly plunge toward Lawn suspended below. Lawn raised his left arm to protect his head instinctively. The first limestone chunk struck his forearm with sickening impact. The force spun him like a pendulum in the narrow pit. A second bigger rock struck him squarely in the lower back. The force drove the air from his lungs audibly. The chamber erupted into panic as training became real rescue. The team immediately reversed the rope system to lower Lawn down. They could hear Lawn groaning in pain from the impacts below. A weak response confirmed he was conscious but badly hurt. When Lawn reached the bottom, instructors prepared for medical assessment. The assessment revealed severe bruising to his arm and lower back trauma. They decided to evacuate Lawn through a horizontal entrance 300 yards away. This avoided the dangerous vertical pit with loose rock threatening above. After 45 minutes, they emerged to waiting paramedics outside. An ambulance transported Lawn to the nearest emergency hospital. Paradise Springs Cave Incident. In September 1996, 2 recreational divers went to Paradise Springs in Marion County, Florida. These weren't professional cave divers, but open water divers with only basic scuba certification. Open water divers are trained for oceans or lakes where you can swim directly to the surface. Cave diving is completely different and requires specialized training and equipment. The 2 divers made their first critical error before entering the water. They decided to explore the underwater cave without a guideline. In cave diving, a guideline is a rope that leads back to the entrance. Without a guideline, you can become lost in an underwater maze with no way out. But these 2 divers didn't understand this fundamental safety principle. They entered Paradise Springs without any form of navigation aid. They relied only on their ability to remember the route back. The divers descended into the cave system, going deeper and deeper. They reached a depth of 148 feet, far inside the cave system. They were far from any natural light and completely dependent on artificial lighting. At 148 feet deep, they were in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. Then disaster struck in the form of a silt out. Silt outs occur when sediment on the cave floor gets stirred up by movements. This creates a cloud of particles that reduces visibility to absolute zero. The 2 divers caused a massive silt out at 148 feet deep. The clear water was suddenly replaced by thick silt, making navigation impossible. In zero visibility, the male diver became separated from his partner. Losing contact with your dive buddy in darkness is a nightmare scenario. The male diver began searching frantically for a way out without a guideline. He was essentially swimming blind through an underground maze. In his desperate search, the diver made a fatal error. He attempted to squeeze through what he thought was a passage out. Instead, he wedged himself into a small crack in the cave wall. Once stuck in this tight space, he couldn't move forward or backward. He was 148 feet underwater in complete darkness, trapped in a rock crevice. Meanwhile, his diving partner saw him disappear into the silt cloud. She witnessed what appeared to be a cave collapse. She believed her partner was crushed and made the decision to surface for help. When emergency responders arrived about an hour later, they organized a cave rescue. Professional cave diving rescue teams entered following proper protocols. They laid guidelines behind them and worked to locate the missing diver. The rescue team found the trapped diver wedged in a small crevice. However, their initial attempts to extract him were unsuccessful. They called in the specialized NSS Cave Diving Section Recovery Team. When this elite team investigated, they discovered what had actually happened. The cave had not collapsed as the female diver believed. The trapped diver, probably running low on air, convinced himself he couldn't get free. In absolute panic, he released his diving harness and backed out of the crevice. He then began a free ascent, swimming toward the surface, holding his breath. A free ascent from 148 feet without equipment is extremely dangerous. The tragic irony is that by releasing his harness, he had actually freed himself. If he had remained calm and waited, rescue teams might have extracted him. But panic drove him to make decisions that turned survival into death. Center of the Earth Cave Incident. On January 10, 1990, 3 people entered a lava cave in Hawaii for a relaxing sauna experience. The cave near Route 137 in Hawaii's Puna district was known as Nature's Underground Spa. It had hot water pools and temperatures that reached 96 degrees from ancient volcanic activity. Rodney Armour, 55 years old, was visiting with his wife Jo and friend Mauve Pfizer. The 3 arrived at the cave entrance in a natural sink dropping 11 feet from ground level. At the bottom was the entrance to what locals called the Center of the Earth Cave. The cave's entrance was immediately challenging with a narrow descending tube. You had to crawl through a tunnel with rock pressing from all sides. Once through that constriction, the cave opened up significantly into larger passages. The cave system was extensive, as large as a city block with many side passages. The heat was intense at 96 degrees with high humidity from hot water pools. Rodney, Jo, and Mauve began exploring using only flashlights with no specialized equipment. They had no ropes, helmets, backup lighting, or communication devices. At some point during exploration, Rodney became separated from his wife and Mauve. In the large cave with numerous side passages, he took a wrong turn. For Rodney, being alone in the intensely hot environment was immediately stressful. Instead of staying put and calling out, Rodney began making desperate choices. In his panicked state, he started moving deeper into the cave system. He was no longer thinking logically about navigation or safety. Each turn he took pushed him further from the main routes. The passages Rodney chose were getting narrower and more restrictive. Instead of recognizing this as a warning, his panicked mind pushed forward. Eventually, Rodney found a particularly narrow passage angling downward diagonally. Experienced explorers would avoid such passages, especially when alone, but Rodney's panic had overtaken his rational thinking completely. He began squeezing himself into the narrow diagonal constriction. As he wedged in, he quickly realized he had made a terrible mistake. The passage was barely wide enough with solid rock pressing from all sides. He couldn't turn around, couldn't back out, and couldn't move forward. He was effectively trapped in a stone coffin angled downward. The psychological impact of being wedged was catastrophic. Complete panic set in as his breathing became rapid and shallow. His heart rate skyrocketed and he experienced a full-blown panic attack. He was hyperventilating in the hot, humid air while his body overheated. His mind was consumed with the terror of being buried alive. Meanwhile, Jo and Mauve realized Rodney was missing and called out for him. But in the cave with branching passages and echoes, their voices never reached him. After searching as long as they dared, they exited to call for help. At 2:30 p.m., they reported Rodney missing to emergency services. The rescue operation was urgent and incredibly challenging in the extreme heat. Professional rescue teams organized searches in 20-minute shifts to prevent heat exhaustion. They systematically searched the cave system following proper protocols. When rescuers finally found Rodney, the scene was tragic. He was wedged deep in the narrow diagonal passage head down. It was immediately clear that Rodney had died from cardiac arrest. By 4:15 p.m., they had successfully removed his body from the cave. Sierra Nevada Cave Incident. During the summer of 1990, cave explorers surveyed a cave system in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. The group had spent hours underground working through various sections with surveying equipment. By the time they headed for the entrance, they were physically exhausted. The exit route took them to where an underground stream descended to a lower level. Rather than following the water, the group proceeded along a narrow canyon passage. Derek High was the last one in line as they walked through the narrow passage. As Derek walked, he noticed something unusual about the floor ahead. There was a section where where the surface appeared lower, like a dip in the ground. The floor looked somewhat fragile, but also seemed solid enough to walk on. The floor wasn't bedrock, but a thin layer of debris over a vertical crevice. The crack dropped straight down to the stream 35 feet below. As Derek stepped forward, putting his full weight on what he thought was solid ground, disaster struck. Without any warning, the floor completely disappeared beneath his feet. Derek suddenly found himself falling into a pitch-black void. His neck caught on the edges of the crevice opening. Derek's entire body weight was suddenly being supported by his neck alone. He was suspended in the vertical shaft by his neck, with his body hanging below. The pain was excruciating and the pressure on his neck was enormous. Then the situation got worse as rocks and debris started falling. Rocks wedged around Derek's neck, piling against his trapped head and shoulders. Derek threw his arms outward against the crevice walls. The shaft was narrow enough that he could reach both walls. Using a technique called chimneying, Derek pressed against both walls with all his strength. By pushing hard against the walls, he took the crushing pressure off his neck. His neck slowly loosened up, but the crevice walls started collapsing again. More debris cascaded down from above like a deadly waterfall. The falling debris pushed Derek downward, forcing him deeper into the shaft. Derek kept slipping further down with only his arm pressure preventing a fatal fall. Then a large piece of debris slammed into his shoulder. For a split second, he lost his grip and dropped several more feet. Derek was now 15 feet deep inside the vertical shaft. His arms were already shaking from the constant strain. Once his muscles gave out completely, he would fall to his death below. The other spelunkers heard the catastrophic collapse behind them. They found a gaping hole where solid ground should have been. When they shined lights down, they saw Derek wedged 15 feet below. His arms were visibly shaking, and it was clear he couldn't hold much longer. The group quickly retrieved rope from their equipment. When the rope reached Derek, they told him to tie it around his torso, but Derek's arms were the only thing keeping him from falling. If he released pressure to work with the rope, he would fall. He quickly released both arms and grabbed onto the rope. He plummeted a few inches, but managed to get a good grip. Through desperation and willpower, Derek looped the rope around his torso. The others told Derek to try climbing while they pulled from above, but Derek was utterly exhausted and his muscles wouldn't respond. He looked up and shook his head. They would have to pull him up. The group positioned themselves around the opening and began pulling on the count. Derek was essentially dead weight, unable to assist in his own rescue. After several minutes of intense effort, Derek's head appeared at the edge. With a final coordinated heave, Derek was hauled over the edge to solid ground. Against all odds, Derek had survived a situation that should have killed him. The group marked the dangerous crevice with clear warnings for future explorers. Thunderhole Cave Incident. On July 15, 1995, two experienced cave divers prepared for a dive into Thunderhole Cave in Florida. Robert McGuire and Del Mose had planned this dive meticulously over the previous weeks. The dive plan used mixed gas diving with different nitrogen and oxygen mixtures at various depths. Two separate breathing mixtures had been prepared with clear labels on each tank. One was a standard mix for deeper portions, and another was a 50-50 mix for shallow depths. McGuire had taken Sudafed tablets that morning because his sinuses were bothering him. McGuire and Mose entered the water together shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning. The descent began smoothly through crystal clear water with excellent visibility. At 70 feet below the surface, they reached their first planned waypoint. This was where McGuire should have switched tanks and left the 50-50 mix for later. The 50-50 mixture was perfect for shallow stops, but dangerous at greater depth. But somehow the switch never happened correctly during the routine dive. Perhaps McGuire became disoriented, or maybe the Sudafed affected his mental clarity. He continued his descent with the wrong tank, carrying the 50-50 mix deeper. Mose had no reason to question his partner's gas management decisions. Each diver was responsible for their own gas selection in technical diving. They continued downward through increasingly narrow passages in the cave. At 140 feet below the surface, they reached their planned maximum depth. The pressure at this depth was more than 5 times the pressure at sea level. McGuire's regulator delivered the 50-50 mix smoothly with nothing feeling wrong. But the 50-50 mix that was safe at 70 feet had become deadly poison at 140 feet. Oxygen itself becomes toxic to the human nervous system under too much pressure. McGuire and Mose spent approximately 15 minutes at maximum depth exploring. Everything seemed normal as both divers checked their dive computers regularly. Then they began the long ascent with careful decompression stops at various depths. They were somewhere around 70 feet when everything went catastrophically wrong. Without any warning, McGuire's body went completely rigid in the water. His regulator fell from his mouth as violent convulsions seized his entire frame. His arms jerked wildly and his legs kicked in random directions. Mose spun around and watched his friend thrashing uncontrollably in horror. He lunged forward trying to stabilize McGuire and get the regulator back. But oxygen toxicity seizures are nearly impossible to manage underwater. McGuire's jaw clenched tight, making it impossible to hold the regulator. Water flooded into McGuire's lungs with each involuntary gasp for air. Mose struggled desperately against his friend's thrashing limbs trying to help. McGuire's lungs filled with water and oxygen deprivation claimed his brain. The thrashing stopped and McGuire went limp in the water as dead weight. Mose held his friend's body, knowing it was already too late to help. Now Mose faced the nightmare scenario every dive buddy fears. His partner was dead. Mose secured his friend's body and completed his own decompression stops. Each minute was an agony of grief and shock for the surviving diver. When he finally surfaced hours later alone, the full weight crashed down on him. His friend had died from a simple mistake of using the wrong tank at the wrong depth. Taubery Bay incident. On January 5th, 2023, an experienced diver descended into the waters off the coast of Mexico. The waters are rich with sea life, providing abundant catches of fish and shellfish. Manuel Nablas Lopez was 53 years old and very experienced in diving these waters. He had spent decades diving to significant depths, harvesting various species of shellfish. Lopez was a professional who understood the ocean and respected its dangers. On this particular morning, Lopez was part of a small crew harvesting axe scallops. These scallops live on the seafloor at significant depths in the Gulf. Lopez was using a surface-supplied air system connected to the boat by a long hose. This system allowed him to stay underwater for extended periods without running out of air. The plan was straightforward: descend to the seafloor between 36 to 59 feet deep. His companions would remain on the support vessel above managing his air supply. As Lopez descended that morning, the water conditions were less than ideal. The visibility was relatively murky, making it harder to see potential dangers. Lopez was working near the seafloor, moving among schools of fish, searching for scallops. He was wearing a black wetsuit, which is standard equipment for divers. His movements through the water created vibrations that predators could detect from far away. What Lopez and his crew didn't know was that they weren't alone that morning. Somewhere in the murky waters below, a massive great white shark was cruising the area. This particular shark was enormous, estimated to be about 19 feet long. A 19-foot great white shark weighs around 2,000 to 2,500 pounds. These are apex predators that have perfected their hunting techniques for millions of years. The shark struck Lopez with immense force, closing its jaws around his upper body. This was a full predatory strike from one of the ocean's most powerful predators. The crew members on the support vessel had no warning anything was wrong. They felt unusual tension in the line and began pulling Lopez back to the surface. When they pulled Lopez's body up, the scene was something out of a nightmare. Their colleague had been destroyed by the shark attack with massive injuries. It was immediately clear that he was dead. The entire attack unfolded in a matter of seconds, possibly less than 5 seconds. There was no prolonged struggle or opportunity to fight back or escape. By the time they pulled Lopez up, there was nothing that could be done. Marine biologists confirmed Lopez's injuries were consistent with a great white shark bite. Turkey Cave incident. On October 15, 1994, 6 experienced spelunkers entered Turkey Cave in Virginia with special permission. Turkey Cave sits in Rockbridge County and had been closed to explorers for several years. Benjamin Schwartz, John Murray, Bob Thrun, Janice and Tony Preston, and Ted Andrus entered to conduct a survey. The group made their way through the entrance passages that quickly widened into the big room. From the big room, they entered a passageway leading to a 15-foot drop to the lower level. Only a few feet into this passage, Janice Preston suddenly developed a breathing problem. She started gasping for air with her chest tightening as she struggled to get oxygen. Janice pushed through a tight constriction and dropped into a small room on the other side. She finally managed to catch her breath in the confined chamber. The group decided her medication from earlier that morning probably caused her breathing problem. They decided to continue with the survey, thinking it was just a minor issue. Then John Murray mentioned something that should have been a major warning sign. His carbide lamp was having trouble staying lit. Other members started noticing the same problem with their lamps flickering and dimming. Benjamin Schwartz reached the rigging point for the 15-foot drop, but had trouble catching his breath. He noticed the carbide lamps were burning with an unusual yellow color. They were in bad air. Bad air in caves is invisible, odorless, and kills by depleting oxygen from your blood. Everyone in the group began experiencing severe trouble breathing simultaneously. Schwartz made the call that they needed to exit the cave immediately. Ted Andrus was hit particularly hard by the bad air. His thinking became severely impaired as oxygen deprivation affected his brain. Andrus's condition continued to decline as they moved through the passages. His movements became slower and more uncoordinated. The others realized Andrus was on the edge of losing consciousness completely. If he passed out in the narrow passages, getting him out would be impossible. Bob Thrun and Tony Preston positioned themselves on either side of Andrus. They began essentially dragging him through the passages toward better air. The other members were barely managing to keep themselves moving forward. Every minute felt like an hour as they struggled toward the big room. They could feel themselves getting weaker with vision starting to tunnel. Andrus was fading in and out of consciousness as they dragged him forward. Finally, after desperate struggle, the group reached the big room. The air quality in the larger chamber was dramatically better. Everyone started gulping air as their lungs finally got adequate oxygen. Andrus slowly began to recover as his blood oxygen levels returned to normal. The group sat in the big room for an extended period to recover. Before leaving, they marked the dangerous passage with clear warning signs. Cave incident. On June 15, 2002, 26-year-old Mark Orr and 3 friends had traveled to explore Cave in Florida. All 4 divers were certified open water divers with basic scuba training. The group had basic scuba gear but not cave diving equipment like redundant air systems. They brought one rope to use as a guideline to follow back to the entrance. The water at the cave entrance was impossibly clear. They descended into the water and the first few minutes were magical. The cave opened into a large chamber with stunning rock formations. But as they moved deeper, the passages became narrower and natural light faded to black. They were now completely dependent on their flashlights to see. Then disaster struck when one diver accidentally kicked the cave floor. A cloud of silt exploded upward like an underwater dust storm. Within seconds, the crystal clear water turned into a brown soup. Visibility dropped to 0 where Mark couldn't see his hand in front of his face. Panic set in immediately as Mark couldn't see his fellow divers or the guideline. Mark reached out blindly trying to find the rope or his diving partners. His hands found only rock walls and water. As panic increased, his air consumption skyrocketed as panic drove his breathing rate higher and higher. In panic conditions, a tank could be empty in just 15 minutes. Mark's hands scraped against limestone walls as he searched desperately for the way out. Then Mark remembered passing through a large chamber with an air pocket earlier. With his air gauge approaching 0, Mark made a desperate gamble. He stopped swimming horizontally and instead kicked upward, hoping to find that air pocket. His head broke the surface just as his regulator delivered its last breath of air. Mark gasped in the cave air with his heart pounding hard. He was alive, but his situation was still desperate in the darkness. He was in an air pocket roughly 10 feet wide with a small ledge above water. Mark hauled himself onto the ledge. Now came the worst part, the waiting in absolute darkness. Mark had no idea if his fellow divers had made it out safely. He was alone deep inside an underwater cave with no air supply. Exhausted from the ordeal, Mark fell asleep leaning on the cold ledge. Above ground, Mark's diving partners had managed to escape the cave. They emerged panicked, realizing Mark was still missing, and immediately called for help. Scott Hunsucker, a certified cave diving instructor, received the call about the missing diver. 6 hours after Mark entered the cave, Hunsucker descended into the water. He navigated the cave system with expertise. He carried redundant air systems, multiple powerful lights, and proper guidelines. When Hunsucker reached the large chamber with the air pocket, he surfaced cautiously. There was Mark Orr, alive, leaning on a ledge in his dive gear. Hunsucker gave Mark a spare regulator connected to his redundant air system. Using proper cave diving techniques and following a guideline, Hunsucker led Mark out. Low Berkowitz Cave incident. In 2005, an experienced cave diver entered a remote British cave system to continue exploration work. The exploration had been abandoned 30 years earlier by other divers. Low Berkowitz Cave is located in the Yorkshire Dales of England. The cave had been partially explored back in the 1970s. Colin Pryor was an experienced cave diver qualified to take on this challenge. He understood the unique dangers of exploring flooded underground passages. The sections of Low Berkowitz that Pryor was diving were low, narrow passages filled with fine silt. In the 1970s, the original divers laid guideline through the passages they explored. When those divers finished, they didn't remove all their guidelines from the cave. Over 30 years, this old line had deteriorated and become loose. It was now floating freely in the flooded passages. Pryor entered the water and began his dive. He was laying his own guideline as he went deeper into the system. He navigated through the tight passages, carefully avoiding stirring up fine silt. As Pryor pushed deeper, he began encountering the old guideline from the 1970s explorations. At first, this wasn't alarming as it confirmed he was following the original route, but Pryor didn't realize how degraded and dangerous this old line had become. Instead of being secure and attached, it had become loose and floating everywhere. As Pryor continued deeper, he encountered more and more of this deteriorated line. It was draped across the route, hanging from the ceiling, and coiled on the floor. In the confined space, it was almost impossible to avoid contact with the old line. As he maneuvered through a tight section, the old guideline wrapped around his equipment. In the limited visibility, Pryor didn't notice it at first, but as he moved forward, the entanglement got worse with every movement. The old line wrapped around more of his equipment, creating complex tangles. Pryor realized he was caught and immediately stopped moving to assess his situation. In cave diving, entanglement is one of the most feared hazards. Pryor reached for his knife to cut away the old guideline wrapped around him, but the old line wasn't just wrapped around one piece of equipment. It was tangled around multiple points on his body and gear, creating a complex web. Every time Pryor cut away one section, he discovered more tangles elsewhere. Pryor realized he was in serious trouble with the entanglement more complex than he thought. His air supply was running lower than it should be for his position. The silt was stirring up from all his movement, reducing visibility to zero. As his air supply continued to drop, Pryor made increasingly desperate decisions. The final minutes of Colin Pryor's life would have been absolutely terrifying. He knew his air was running out and he was still trapped. He knew that time had run out for any chance of reaching safety. As his air supply finally ran out completely, Pryor took his last breaths. Colin Pryor drowned in that low, silty passage in Low Berkowitz Cave. Whiting's Neck Cave Incident. On November 17, 1979, 4 experienced spelunkers from the Baltimore Grotto arrived at the Whiting's Neck Cave. Whiting's Neck Cave sits in the Panhandle area of West Virginia. By 1979, it had earned a reputation as an easy, beginner-friendly cave system. Richard Trayer, George Nichols, Mike Lures, and Steve Jensen were all seasoned cave explorers. They had brought along 4 novices getting their first real caving experience. The group entered through the back entrance and made their way to the main feature. The main feature was a 45-foot inclined drop that required proper rope work to descend safely. The Baltimore Grotto members rigged a handline on the left side of the drop. All 8 members of their group went down without incident as planned. Then a second group arrived at the top of the drop and things started going wrong. This second group was led by someone described as a military type A personality. He seemed knowledgeable and projected confidence, convincing about 15 teenagers to follow him. Of these 15 young people, 2 were deaf, adding communication difficulties. The leader of the second group looked at the Baltimore Grotto's handline and rejected it. Instead of using the safe setup, he rigged his own line right in the middle. He placed it directly over a 10-foot section of completely free vertical drop. The Baltimore Grotto members offered to let the second group use their handline twice, but the military-type leader refused both times, convinced his way was better. Then members of the second group started body rappelling down the poorly positioned rope. Steve Jensen and others watched in horror as the group had no idea what they were doing. Jensen yelled for Richard Trayer because someone was going to get seriously hurt or killed. In the next few minutes, the situation went from bad to catastrophic. One deaf girl fell 20 feet down the drop, tumbling and bouncing off the rock face. Miraculously, she wasn't seriously injured. Before anyone could respond, another person fell, dropping 10 feet before hitting the slope. Again, through luck, there were no serious injuries. 2 other members had made it partway down before becoming completely stranded. They had descended to a point where they couldn't continue down or climb back up, terrified and unable to move. The Baltimore Grotto members watched this disaster with horror and anger. The military-type leader had refused help and was now responsible for multiple falls. There were still more people from his group waiting at the top to attempt descent. Someone was going to die if they didn't intervene immediately and forcefully. Steve Jensen and his companions confronted the leader and gave him a direct order. Leave the cave now and take your group with you. It wasn't a suggestion, but a command. But first, they had to deal with the 2 people stranded on the rope. The Baltimore Grotto members organized a proper rescue operation. This was exhausting, dangerous work, pulling them up the steep, irregular slope. Through careful coordination and significant effort, they got both people back to the top. Once everyone was accounted for and immediate danger was resolved, the inexperienced group and their overconfident leader were done for the day. They were exiting the cave immediately with no more rope work or exploration.